Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and this is kind of like a special edition of the podcast because we're actually doing Emerging Revolutionary War today. And joining me is Marianne Holdzkom, a professor at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. Marianne, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. I read your book. Here, I'm going to hold it up, see if it doesn't vanish.
Yay, thank you.
Remembering John Adams, which I picked up at the Adams Historical Park in Quincy. And I just loved this book. And I'm like, I need an excuse to call her up and talk to her. So
Oh,
thank
thank you so much. I
you. Yeah.
appreciate that.
Well, I'm a big John Adams fanboy. And in our correspondence, I've discovered you're a big John Adams fangirl. So
Yeah,
it's great to spend some time with you. So
great.
let me ask you, because one of the premises of the book is that John Adams really hasn't been as forgotten as people tend to think he is, but the common chorus is like, oh, John Adams, he's been forgotten. But he's kind of not.
Right, exactly. It may have been true in 1920 or 1930 to talk about him as neglected, but in this day and age, I just don't think we can say that anymore. There's a lot of scholarly work out there, and the popular culture. I was amazed when I started doing my research how many places he pops up in popular culture. So I don't think we can say that he's neglected or forgotten anymore.
And maybe the premise of the idea that he's forgotten probably goes back to the landscape in Washington, D.C. Tell me a little bit about that.
That is correct. He does not have a monument in Washington, D.C., and there are forces at work now who are making progress to change that. I'm happy to be part of the Adams Memorial Foundation, and they have a place now. The bill has passed the House of Representatives. I think they're still working on the Senate. So we're making progress there, but he has definitely been forgotten there. And it's been a long history trying to correct that, starting way back, even with Senator Ted Kennedy, trying to change all of that. And I would also say that there is an abundance of memorials to the Virginia founders. And so there's that gap there. We need to look at John Adams in Massachusetts and the contributions that he made as well.
And like there isn't even a John Adams statue in Boston, which is, a little strange since that's kind of where he's grounded professionally, aside from his home in Quincy. Why is that? Why has that been overlooked?
Well, I think that he is far more associated with Quincy, whereas Samuel Adams is much more attached to Boston, even though Samuel Adams was born in Quincy, as I understand it. And but he really made his home there. John Adams was kind of in and out of Boston. He preferred being in Quincy or Braintree as it was for many, many years. And so I think the whole city of Quincy has dedicated itself to being the place where John Adams is remembered more than Boston. Although, if you go to places like the Boston Massacre site, certainly the history there discusses him and his role in the trials and so forth. But yeah, there's no statue in the city.
Yeah. And you have a wonderful chapter in your book that talks about the relationship between John and Quincy. And you make this statement at first I thought was really big and bold. And you said that no president is more associated with a place than John Adams is with Quincy. And you mentioned Monticello and Jefferson and Mount Vernon in Washington. And those things obviously just come to mind. But then you really make this great argument like, it's not just the house, it's the home, it's the community, it's the place. Tell me a little bit about that because I thought it was a great argument.
Well, I appreciate that, and I wish I could take credit for it, but that is an argument that came from the executive director of the Quincy Historical Society, Dr. Edward Fitzgerald. And it was a revelation to me, too, to think about it. But he made that statement saying that there's no other place where a whole town, is connected to this man. So you have the Adams National Historical Park, which preserves the birthplaces and Peacefield, and you have that lovely little background there to remind us of that. But you also have the Quincy Historical Society that works hard to put the Adamses in Quincy history as well. And the Adams Academy, where the Historical Society is located, was an idea of John Adams. He deeded that land and also, I believe, the granite to build that building because he wanted to see a school of classics built in Quincy. So you have that. You have the Hancock Adams Common now, which was dedicated in 2018, which is dedicated to John Hancock, but also to John Adams. And since I wrote my book, you have a new statue of Abigail Adams. You have a new statue just very, very recently of John Quincy Adams. So the city and the city leadership, I think more than anything else, is really dedicated to preserving that history. And one of the interesting quotes I found from the dedication of the Hancock Adams Common was the mayor of Quincy saying, until there's a monument in Washington, D.C., we will be John Adams Monument. And so he feels this to his core, I think,
Yeah.
and it really reflects on what the city is doing.
Yeah. And you've read his correspondence with Abigail, and he's frequently talking like, I wish I was back at home. I was walking the fields. I was, going down to the shore. I mean, he constantly looks at that as his idyllic place to be and be himself.
Absolutely. It was his happy place. There's no question about it. He was also, I don't think, really comfortable in a city setting. If you go to Quincy now, it's hard to believe that it was rural and that there was a farm there behind the Adams birthplace and so forth. And it's too bad that we don't see that, although I'm really happy that the houses are still standing. They're the oldest presidential birthplaces that are still in existence. And so that's a wonderful thing to have. But I think he was much more comfortable on his farm near the seaside. He talks about needing the sea air for his health. And when he lacks that, he really, really feels it to his core. So, on the one hand, I think he was very happy there. On the other hand, I think his ambition just drove him to be elsewhere so often. And there are a few scholars out there that read his musing about Braintree or Quincy with sort of cynicism, thinking, well, did he really feel this way? If he did, why wasn't he home more? Um, but that gets into his drive and his ambition more than anything else, I think.
Yeah, and I'm, as someone who has a long distance commute to get to work, because I teach in Western New York and live in Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Oh,
And I
wow.
definitely know that feel of like, oh, I feel the tug to be at this place, but I wish I was, and it's just,
Yeah.
it's,
Mhm.
it, it's a tough spot for a person to be in. So I think maybe one of the things I find most sympathetic about him because he's driven by this duty, but he's also just longing for home the whole time.
Yes, absolutely. There's no question that he was driven. There's no question that he was ambitious, but there was his safe place. And I think that's home. And right now, I'm kind of following him from 250 years ago with his diary entries and his letters and so forth. And right now, it's complete silence because he's home.
Yeah.
And there are people who are corresponding to him, but I'm not finding any letters from him. He just wants to be home. He wants to be with Abigail. He wants to be with his kids and get refreshed and recharged before he has to return to the Second Continental Congress.
So Joe Ellis has described that as the paradox of proximity. We know the least about his home life because he's not writing letters. Um,
Right.
as someone who spent a lot of time in the correspondence, what do you make of that? And how do you work around that as a scholar?
It's difficult. I think we all would like to imagine what was happening behind those walls and what he was saying to Abigail. Because when they weren't apart, they obviously weren't writing letters to each other, but they were clearly discussing what was going on in the world. And we'll just never know what those conversations were. So we rely on the correspondence and we extrapolate a lot from what they're writing to one another. And there are huge gaps there, even gaps when he's gone, where he doesn't correspond nearly as much as Abigail would like him to. and especially when he's overseas, because there are long periods of silence there, and it's frustrating as a scholar.
Hmm.
But I'm grateful to John Adams and to Abigail and to the whole family, John Quincy in particular, because they understood the history of the moment. And so John Adams begins this practice of keeping a diary. And he begins this at a very young age. We found an earliest diary from when he was at Harvard College in the 1750s. And so he puts things out there that other founders don't. We don't know a lot about Jefferson's personal life or Washington's personal life because they simply didn't write about it. But John Adams is so transparent that way, that we owe him a great debt. And I think that's one of the reasons why he tends to get under the microscope a little bit more than these other guys because we do know so much.
Yeah, and it feels like he's really honest with himself, and he wrestles with his vanity, and then he writes about wrestling with his vanity.
Yes.
And then I think modern audiences look at that and like, oh, look, he's so vain, and so like they criticize him because he was honest with himself in his own personal journal that he didn't necessarily think people were going to eventually read. So like he sort of like helps and hurts himself in that regard, I think.
Yes, he does. Especially in his younger years, if you read that diary, you just want to intervene. I mean, you just want to go and give him a big hug because he is beating himself up constantly. And anyone who's been through their 20s understands those feelings, but his is just over the top. And I think when he meets Abigail and he sees that there's a balance to all of this, that improves a little bit. I think she makes a huge difference for him. But in those early years, he is beating himself up. And the other thing I would say about that, since you brought that up, I found it really interesting. David McCullough talks about this, that John Adams is self-described in the Second Continental Congress as obnoxious
Right.
and unpopular and suspected. But David McCullough points out if you look at what other people are saying about him in 1776, no one describes him that way.
Mhm.
It's a self description.
That
And,
comes years later.
and it
You know?
comes years later when
Yeah.
he's reflecting on all of this. And for some reason, it's stuck to him like glue. He can't get rid of it now. And it's a running joke in 1776, but the trope continues, I think, in the John Adams miniseries, where you don't see a lot of the softer sides to him.
Mhm. And I think about that episode he has with John Dickinson, who they butt heads with, and Adams writes to a friend about like Dickinson and says some unflattering things. The letter gets intercepted, published. Dickinson gets mad about it, and then Benjamin Rush says, nobody talked about Adams, and he was the most disliked man in Congress. So you get an episode like that like, oh yes, well he must be obnoxious. Look, this happened, but like you don't see some of that softer side that you mentioned.
Right,
Um,
right.
where does that softer side come out for you as a historian as you look at these things?
There are a couple of places that I find it. First of all, is his sense of humor. I think this is something that's really overlooked, but if you spend any time at all in his diary, his sense of humor is sharp, it's intelligent, and it's delightful in a lot of ways. And he's not laughing at anybody in particular most of the time. He's mostly laughing at himself, but he also has a wonderful way of putting words together that are just glorious. Like his description near the end of the First Continental Congress when he talks about every man is a great man and we have to have rhetoric about two and three make five. And it's a delightful passage. And if I could ever memorize it, I would just spiel it out there. So that's one place. The other place is his capacity for friendship, which I think is sometimes overlooked as well. Even though famously John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are the friends that we think about. And it was John Adams, by the way, who was the hero in that relationship and stepped up and reopened the doors. Just wanted to mention that.
I agree.
um, the other friendship that's really important to him was his friendship with Jonathan Sewell, which I think is vastly overlooked. There is a book out there now about that friendship, and I'm glad to see it. But he really loved that man. He was as close to a best friend as he ever had, and he had to say goodbye to him in 1774. And he said, this is the sharpest thorn upon which I've ever placed my foot. I mean, it really broke him. And that tends to get overlooked. You rarely see it in the popular culture, except in Catherine Drinker Bowen's John Adams, The American Revolution. She makes a good point of talking about that friendship. But otherwise, you just don't see that he loved deeply. And he could hate deeply too. I,
Yeah,
I think the one person he never, ever, ever forgave was Alexander Hamilton.
right.
You may disagree with that. I'd love to talk to
No,
you.
I agree 100%.
But otherwise, he was able to come to terms with what people had said about him. He reconciled with Mercy Otis Warren at the end of his life and Thomas Jefferson at the end of his life. So that heart for friendship is another place where I find this softer side that gets belittled. It's just not there in a lot of what we see.
Yeah, and I think about his relationship with Benjamin Franklin, whom he
Mhm.
respected and then grew to just loathe. And then
Yes.
even in his later years there, he's like, "Oh yeah, all his writings are fantastic and they're worth reading."
Yeah,
So like he even mellows out about Franklin, which
he does. Yeah.
at
Yeah.
the height of that rivalry, you'd have never thought that would have thought out.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So your book really kind of traces the ways in which we remember or don't remember John Adams. And you do kind of a neat job of diving into the historiography, into the pop culture, into the physical landscape. Let me just ask you, like, when you first came to this idea, how did you decide to kind of organize and unpack all of this?
Oh, that's a great question. And it took years,
Yeah.
literally years, for me to figure out how to do this. I had done a conference paper on that point in time in the Second Continental Congress and the popular culture depictions of that. But I had long wanted to do a John Adams in History and Memory project. And I realized that the historiography alone would be massive. So I just started reading and rereading. I've probably read Page Smith's biography 3 or 4 times
Yeah.
now, and it's a 2 volume work, so that's no easy task. But I decided that in order to set the backdrop for what we know in popular culture and from what the public gets, I had to talk about what the scholars have said
Hmm.
and to kind of do that comparison to see how we present his history beyond the scholarship. And I also really had no huge intention to dive into the literature, but there's so much of it. And I didn't realize. And I had to kind of readjust my brain and read Ezra Pound. I don't know if you're
Congratulations
familiar.
on that, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I
Pound
know
is just difficult to read anyway, right?
it it is, and I don't want to offend anybody. It's just not my thing. It's a little too abstract
Yeah.
for my brain, but I had to deal with it because Ezra Pound saw something in him too, to dedicate an entire portion of his cantos to him. So dealing with that was something. So it just sort of morphed over time into this larger work. And the one area that I didn't go to was artistic works or paintings, portraits of him. And I did have someone suggest that maybe that would be a good article. but I'm not an art historian. I'm a little nervous about that. And
Yeah.
that was the other challenge with this book is that I was looking into a lot of different disciplines, film studies, literature adaptation, public history. I don't have a degree in public history, and so knowing how to do that field work and how to do the interviews, it was a steep learning curve for me. So when I came out on the other side of it and I had put this nice, concise book together, I thought, well, it's all out there and people can kind of pick and choose what area they want to concentrate on. But it was quite a task. But I knew years and years ago that I wanted to do something like this for John Adams because it was kind of a popular thing to do with other figures from the Civil
Mm,
War in particular.
sure, sure.
So I thought this is cool, and I'm not sure anyone has done this. That's the other thing, trying to find original research in early U.S. history is a huge challenge.
Yeah.
But to my knowledge, no one had ever done anything quite like this.
Yeah.
And so,
I love the book. I just love the book.
oh,
I
thank you.
I like your characterization where you said, I want to do this for John Adams, as opposed to about John Adams. Like there's an element of service to the character in this book, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I don't want anyone to get the idea that I see him as some sort of saint or flawless individual. He was highly flawed, and I think that's why I relate to him so well. Is that, this was a human being. This is not someone etched in marble. He was awkward, and I can relate to that so well. But I've also, for reasons that I still don't fully understand, feel a connection to him that's been around for 50 years now.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I wanted to write this book, as you say, for him rather than just about him. And I hope that he'd be happy with it. I don't know. It's hard to tell.
Well, I think he would be just because he was one of those guys. He wanted the story out there and he wants the facts and then let people make of that as they will. Don't sugarcoat them. So, like, I think you do a really good job of laying out all of the historiography and here's the evidence. You make up your own mind,
Right.
So,
Yeah. I think it's really important to do that. And I'm looking forward to reading your perspective.
oh, thanks, thanks. We're talking about Remembering John Adams and fantastic book by Marianne Holdzkom. Let me ask you, as you got into the historiography, and you mentioned, kind of looking to see what the scholars had written, and seemed sort of surprised that there was so much, which probably underscores that misperception that he's been forgotten, because there have been a lot of people who've written about him. But I think Charles Francis Adams, his grandson, who edits the papers, poses a pretty unique challenge for anybody who's looking at the scholarly work because it sets up some advantages but some disadvantages for studying Adams. What did you find and how did you deal with that?
Well, in reading that biography, it was clearly a biography meant to redeem a grandfather.
Yeah.
And when you go into it understanding that, you know right away where you're going to be led and where you're going to be misled or misguided. And, and what I mean is that Charles Francis Adams was very careful about what episodes he talked about with his grandfather. And so I think it's really important to understand that. But you mentioned him editing John Adams' works, and the things that he tended to take out were things that now we find delightful
Yeah, yeah.
about him. And so there's not a full picture there. But I think it was because the intent was to say, look, this is a guy who deserves our honor. Yeah, he was my grandfather, but let's let's honor him and just wanting to soften out the rougher edges, I think was something that he intended to do. And he's writing in the 19th century. 19th century historians are looking at things rather differently. They don't use footnotes. They just sort of write. And
And
so,
of course, like people are thinking like he's got the authority because he's the grandson, so maybe he doesn't need to note some of that stuff because of course he knows. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And he did have the massive papers that he was going through, but he was able to say, oh, no, we're not going to talk about that, but we will talk about this. And so understanding that intention too is always really important. And it's one of the things that I try to teach my students when I teach historiography, that you have to look at that intent. And they get confused by this because they sometimes don't see it. And I said, sometimes that's not obvious. But in this case, it really was. It was a redemptive work.
And of course, he's doing that during the Victorian era, where like, gosh, we can't even show our ankles. So like,
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
there are things that he's just not going to show about his grandparents' relationship, for instance, that are
Right.
are in the originals that don't make it into the edited works there.
Yes.
Um, so you make a really, I think, excellent point that once the Adams papers get digitized by the Massachusetts Historical Society, now scholars have a different place they can go besides Charles Francis's edited versions. Tell me about like why that was such a big deal.
Well, I think the family had guarded those papers for years, and it tended, the late Kelly Cobble mentioned this too, tended to keep scholars away from him so that we wouldn't know as much. So it was kind of a disservice. But once they finally decided to turn those papers over to the Massachusetts Historical Society and open them to scholars, scholars got a fuller picture of who John Adams was. And one of those scholars, Bernard Balin, talks about what a delight it was to rediscover this man. And he talks, for some reason, this sticks in my brain, but he talks about John Adams describing manure in his diary, and how he loved to talk about what makes up manure and how we have better manure than the English do. And Bernard Balin found this delightful and charming. Whereas this is one of the things Charles Francis Adams didn't want people to know about his grandfather. So having those papers available opens up a whole new person to scholars. And Page Smith was the first historian who got to use those papers with any length at all, and really does a masterful job displaying a person who is highly flawed but highly driven, and who is able to channel his ambition in ways that really make a difference so that he can serve.
Of course, modern audiences probably know Adams best through the David McCullough biography, but you really spend a lot of time talking about Page Smith's two-volume biography. What's your assessment of Smith's work, and why was it so important for later historiography?
Yeah. Page Smith's full biography was probably the first biography that I read.
Okay.
I read Catherine Drinker Bowen's John Adams, The American Revolution first, but then I discovered Page Smith, and I'm reading this in college, a college senior, and everyone else is out at frat parties, and I'm staying home reading John Adams. Um, but I think that's why it had such an impact on me. But Page Smith was also writing in the late 50s, early 60s. He too had an agenda, and I think that he was writing to a Cold War America
Mhm.
that was looking for heroes. And his take on the Alien and Sedition Acts are very interesting because of writing in that period.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to look at how different scholars approach that. But it also set the standard. I think it's still the gold standard. If you want to write about John Adams, if you want to do a biography of John Adams, you have to deal with Page Smith,
Right.
because it's massive. As you say, it's two volumes. It's completely thorough. I don't know that there's anything particularly that he soft pedals or leaves out. And I would be interested to hear if other people disagree with me on that. But it was groundbreaking, and because he had that access to those papers.
In many ways, I think everybody else has sort of followed in the path that Smith blazed because he's working with those papers for the first time. So he finds some of these great nuggets that other biographers have always leaned on, but they didn't have to go mining the dirt to kind of find those gold pieces. Where Smith is the
Exactly.
one who does that, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So then, he's writing in a different generation than McCullough does. You have a whole chapter about McCullough and kind of like McCullough's John Adams as a book, as a figure, as a cultural icon. It's a biography that really sort of transcends history writing in a lot of ways. What was your impression of McCullough's work?
In the interest of full disclosure, I love David McCullough's work.
Okay.
I I have never read anything by him that I didn't like. He is the best storyteller out there. And I try to channel him a
Okay.
little bit. I don't know if anyone picked up on that, but the opening of my introduction was inspired by how David McCullough writes.
Mm,
And I wanted that in there very much. I would agree with some of the criticism that other scholars have laid on this work, that it tends to not take the deep dive on certain issues. And I think it was Pauline Mayer who said, we're kind of missing the crusty guy here in this biography. And she said, he's the crusty guy's delightful too. So I'm sorry that he's gone. I'm not sure I fully agree with that, but I understand the criticism that's coming there. And part of it is also coming from scholars whose work has not gotten the kind of attention that McCullough's would,
right.
because he's a name. And those of us in academe have to know that our books are not going to get out there the way a David McCullough work is going to. But I think overall, he really captured the character of the man. And that's what David McCullough does
Right.
better than anybody else that I know. And I was so disappointed that he died before he could read my book. I
Mm.
really wanted to get his take on that. And that sounds selfish and vain, but
No, I understand though, because if you're writing about John Adams, he's the elephant in the room, right? And so, he has to be contended with, and I could certainly see like, well, you'd kind of want to be able to, swap ideas with him for sure.
yeah, exactly. And I have a signed copy of his biography.
Oh,
I had
nice.
a colleague who um, vacationed on Martha's Vineyard, and David McCullough had a house there. And my colleague said, "Oh, sure, just give me your biography. I'll take it to him this summer and I'll get your autographed." And I thought, okay. So David McCullough wrote this wonderful thing to a fellow John Adams scholar.
Uh,
And I hadn't even started working on the book yet, but I look at that to this day and just missed up a little bit because it's wonderful to have someone describe me that way, especially David McCullough.
yeah, yeah. And I agree with your assessment of it. I mean, he's just a wonderful writer. He's a wonderful storyteller. There isn't a thing he's written that I've read that I just wasn't like, wow, what a piece of writing.
Mhm.
Um, But yeah, I was curious to hear you say like some of the criticism is leveled by people who did not get the renown that he has. And I sort of wondered if there's like a sour grapes element to some of that criticism, but I do think that some of it is valid as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think some of the harsher criticisms do come from people who are dealing with sour grapes.
Hmm.
And it's a shame really because I think they might have valuable arguments, but they get harsh
Hmm.
and strident with those arguments. And to me, that just turns me off. I just
Sure.
close down when I hear that. But sour grapes are really, really hard to deal with.
Yeah.
And every so often they raise their ugly head in my life, and I have to rein that in and say, now wait a minute,
Yeah.
just know who you are and where you're from, and calm down.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a very John Adamsy sort of thing, though, isn't
yeah,
it?
it certainly is. It certainly is. No wonder I relate to him.
I have to, and again, I love McCullough's book. I really like John Ferling's biography. I mean, as like a work of biography, I think Ferling actually probably does a more solid job of getting into the nitty gritty and the analysis and the here's what's really going on. The book probably gets overlooked or overshadowed because McCullough's came out just a few years later. But Ferling's book, I think, is super solid.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And as a matter of fact, I had gone to a talk that Ferling gave here in Atlanta, and he was signing books, and I took my John Adams biography, and I leaned over to him and I said, "I think yours is better than David McCullough's." And he seemed to really appreciate that comment. He kind of blushed and smiled a little bit. But yeah, it is a solid biography. And his criticism of John Adams when it comes to neglect of his family
Yeah,
is
harsh. It's harsh.
it's
Yeah,
harsh. It
yeah,
is harsh. I think it is in part fair.
yeah,
Um, but I wouldn't go so far as, for example, the script writers of the HBO miniseries where they blame Charles' death on John Adams not being there. I think that's a huge leap. There's a lot going on there.
yeah.
Um, but that was one of the things about Furling's work that was just eye-opening to me.
Yeah. He uses the word unconscionable. His separation from his kids at times is unconscionable, which to me was like, wow, that is a big word. But I think that, he backs it up,
Yes.
and there are times where every parent who is separated from their kids for, some length of time feels that tug. And so what do you do about it? And, Adam's answer is, I got to keep doing my duty. And,
Mm,
and that's a really tough spot. Wow.
yeah. One of the areas of popular culture that really deals with that tug is a play called American Primitive, John and Abigail, and I talk about it in the book as well. And you see these scenes just going back and forth of John Adams trying to do his work, and then the kids over here saying, "Daddy, why don't you write to me? Daddy, when are you coming home?" And you see the character of John Adams just dying. I mean, it's killing him to see that. And so, where I would say Furling's criticism is fair, I would also say don't overlook the toll this was taking on John Adams,
Right.
on the father. I think if you dig deep, you can see that he understood that this was harming his kids, but he didn't know exactly what to do.
And
And go ahead.
No, no, and I think maybe the most fascinating outcome of that is probably his great success story with John Quincy, who follows in his footsteps and because, but like old man Adams is like, don't make the mistakes I did.
Exactly.
Don't do this to your family like I did, which is really, I think, an incredible epiphany that he comes to.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And that's the other place where I see the softer side.
Mhm.
I love Joseph Ellis's Passionate Sage.
Yeah, yeah,
Because you get to see the grandfather. You get to see this man in retirement, and you get to see a grandfather who dotes on his grandchildren and says, as you say, to John Quincy, "It- take it easy on your kids here."
yeah. And take it
Because
easy on yourself,
exactly, exactly. I mean, he knows from experience the toll that can take. And so, as a grandfather, he wants to see those kids not have to go through what his own did. So I love that side of him as well.
Yeah, I think I used the word epiphany a second ago, and I don't think it was an epiphany because I think that's something he realized all the way through, as you mentioned earlier. And he just,
Mm,
but the old man can say that to to his son in a way that young John Adams couldn't say that to
right, right,
himself or his kid. Um,
exactly.
you'd mentioned the HBO miniseries, which is adapted from David McCullough's book. What did you think of that?
I loved it overall, and I thought that Paul Giamatti's portrayal was excellent.
Mm,
That he took him over such a long period of time was incredible. Again, I think that there are things that were in McCullough's biography that didn't make it into the script. And I understand it couldn't have been a 20-hour miniseries, but I think that some of those changes and some of those omissions hurt the miniseries just a little bit. I mentioned his friendship with Jonathan Sewell,
Right.
and a lot of people wouldn't recognize in that first episode that Jonathan Sewell is there. He is a character. He's listed in the credits, but you don't really know who he is unless you know who he is, unless you've done the research yourself. And I thought that was a missed opportunity. I really would have loved to see them dive into that. And the the placing and the ages of the children that they changed in the script was baffling to me a little bit. And setting up again what happens to Charles Adams
Right.
along the way, that John was always harsh with him, and I just don't know that that's fair or that that
Mm.
was the case at all. And the other thing that baffled me too was placing the reconciliation with Jefferson where they did.
Yeah.
They made Abigail's death the catalyst for that, and she was alive when they started corresponding again. So I'm not quite sure why they made those changes. But as a biopic, as we call it in the biz, I think it's exceptional.
Mm.
And it deserved every award it got. Paul Giamatti, who didn't fully understand John Adams, I think, but worked with the script and did a marvelous job, was great. Laura Linney, uh,
Yeah. Yeah, she was fantastic. Yeah.
she
Yeah.
was absolutely fantastic. So I loved it, but there were things that I felt were lacking as
Yeah.
well.
And I'll mention our to our viewers and our listeners that you do a really nice job of kind of laying all this out in the book. So I'll refer people to the book if they want some of the details. I mean, to me, it was one of those movies that it was maybe because I knew too much, I was sort of like, oh, well, they did this, they did that. But I think for like a general audience, what a great way to, become introduced to John Adams and become captivated by him because it was a very captivating story, I thought.
Yes, and I know people who watch the John Adams series every 4th of July.
Yeah.
It's something that they do, and I'm really really glad that that's happening. It's a nice introduction to him.
Yeah. A lot of people forget about the Adams Chronicles, which preceded the HBO series. But like the Adams Chronicles also had like a huge impact on, public perception of John Adams. For folks who have forgotten that because it, comes in an earlier age, give us a quick little synopsis of what you thought about the Adams Chronicles.
Yeah, the Adams Chronicles were really interesting in that the Adams family, and I believe the Massachusetts Historical Society too, restricted the scriptwriters to the actual writings of the Adams family. They didn't want them to go off in some sort of dramatic tangent. And so they had that restriction, but I think given that, they did a wonderful job of depicting John Adams' early years where he's trying to become a lawyer, and his early relationship with Abigail. It's one of the few places that you see that, their courtship. Um, so it's a wonderful revelation there as well. Um, and it can be a little stiff sometimes because the dramatic writers weren't allowed to take some license, but it also gives us a marvelous picture into how you would put these people's writings and their letters and their diaries on a stage, how you would dramatize what is already dramatic. So I think it's wonderful that way. And a lot of people, I don't know what they know George Grizzard for. He probably looks the least like John Adams of all the people who depicted him. It's a toss-up really between George Grizzard and William Daniels. Um, but he too came to be very protective of John Adams, and he also recognized that when the Adams Chronicles was running in 1976, that's what people were knowing him for. They were recognizing him as John Adams. And we tend to forget that because he went on to do other things. But but as a faithful depiction of those writings, I think it's a wonderful piece of work. And for PBS, this predates the Downton Abbey years and things like that, but it was huge. It was a
Yeah.
huge rating success. It made some money for them, and they also did the education angle, so people were using it in schools. So it had a huge effect on how the Adamses were depicted.
Yeah. You mentioned William Daniels, and that's probably the other big elephant in the room. And it cracked me up when Hamilton came out as a musical, and people were like, "Oh, look, they're doing the Founding Fathers as a musical. Oh, how clever!" And it's like, you guys have all short memories. Like,
Yes, exactly.
let me tell you, like, and then
Yep.
Adams doesn't even get mentioned in Hamilton, really, except in passing. But like, Adams was the king of the Broadway stage long before Hamilton came along.
Yes. Yeah,
Although
absolutely.
he probably would not appreciate me describing him as a king, though. I'll take that
No,
back.
no, probably not. Or as a Broadway star, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Since this was a genre that didn't exist in his time. But yeah, the William Daniels depiction is what drew me to John Adams in the first place. And I had kind of a dual journey once I discovered 1776 back in 1976, is following John Adams, but also following William Daniels. I'm still a huge fan. He's alive and kicking, 98 years old. So he's still out there. Known for most people as Mr. Feeney in Boy Meets World
Yeah.
now. For my generation, he was Dr. Craig in St. Elsewhere. He was Kit the Car, uh, and John Adams. And I was very, very grateful that his memoir came out as I was writing this book so that I could lean heavily on it and how he interpreted John Adams as well. And I think that characterization, especially in that moment in time, is unmatched.
Mm. Yeah. And one of his real concerns about it was like, it's the Vietnam era. There's a great disillusionment. Who's going to want a patriotic musical during that era? And 1776 turns into a huge, huge hit, transforms his life, and he really recognizes Adams as this transformative figure in his own personal journey.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, he says it was the hardest role he ever played. He was on stage most of the time, so it was exhausting for him. But he also went on to play other Adamses.
Yeah.
He was John Quincy Adams in the Adams Chronicles. He played John Adams again in John Jakes The Rebels. He played Samuel Adams in The Bastard by John Jakes. And he quips that he's played all the Adamses except Abigail. So he, for a long time, he was the go-to Adams actor. He was the person you wanted
Yeah.
in those, even in the voiceovers. He did one of the PBS series long ago, and voiced John Adams for them. So he too, I think, started with the script. And he says, I didn't read any biographies. I didn't do any other research. I went with what the script gave me. But over the years, people sent him biographies, including apparently David McCullough.
Yeah.
He, for me, um, when I read John Adams' letters, that's the voice I hear. I hear William Daniels. For other
I
people, it
liked
might be Paul Giamatti, but for me, it's William Daniels.
Same here. I like Brett Spinney, is that his last name? Who did the revival of 1776? Like, I
Mhm,
thought that was a very good
mhm,
interpretation too.
mhm. Yes.
Yeah. So because of a weird fluke in Broadway rules, Daniels doesn't get Best Actor because his name didn't appear above the title.
That's right. Yeah.
But the musical won a whole bunch of awards. They changed the rules, recognizing that he probably got robbed of Best Lead. But then I also think about like Grizzard wins Emmys for portraying Adams. Of course, Paul Giamatti, the cast, they win a bunch of Emmys. So and then when I go back to this idea, like, oh, John Adams is forgotten, but like he's an award-winning president in a way that most of the others aren't.
Absolutely is. Absolutely is. And I'm reminded of a remark too. I think it was the second time that I visited Quincy, and I was standing in that John Adams birthplace that you have behind you and listening to the tour guide give their spiel. And I asked the question, I said, how has the miniseries changed visitorship here? And she said, oh, John Adams is our own little rock star. So yeah, he's Emmy winning, he's a rock star, all because of these popular culture depictions more than anything else.
Yeah, yeah. So as we head into the home stretch here, and we kind of think back about Adams and how he is remembered, misremembered, not remembered. Um, how would you like folks to approach Adams if they want to discover this man?
Oh, that's difficult. What I would hope they would do is look at one of the popular culture depictions first. Start there. Start with Paul Giamatti, start with William Daniels, but then pick up a biography. It doesn't have to be Page Smith's. There aren't very many people who are going to read a 1,000 page book. But pick up a biography, pick up two, and take that deep dive. You know, once you're introduced to him, once you think you might be interested in this man, don't be afraid to take the deep dive. And also, a wonderful resource out there. You mentioned the digital Adams papers. Go in and read some of those. They're fascinating. You can also go to Founders Online and read his letters so that you can get a firsthand look at who this guy was, how he perceived things, and how he perceived himself.
Hmm.
And I think if people would do that, they would get a three-dimensional human being here who perhaps they can relate to a little bit more than they thought they could.
Yeah. I always like to send people to the primary sources. It can be a little challenging for reading stuff that was written 250, 260, 270 years ago. The language it takes some getting used to.
Yes.
But boy, you read that correspondence between John and Abigail, and I mean, it just comes to life once you can kind of, figure out the translation to read. Like they just come to life, writing back and forth to each other.
Yeah, that was one of my first experiences with the primary sources too. There's a published book out there called The Book of Abigail and John, and it is exclusively their correspondence. And that's another one that I picked up in college, and I was just enthralled from the first letter when he addresses her as Miss Adorable. Uh, it's just delightful.
Yeah.
And so that is an easy way to dip into the primary sources.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll also give a pitch to the folks in Quincy and at the Adams National Park. I'm a big fan of walking in the footsteps of history. I know you are as well. Go see where these people lived and how they interacted, how they're memorialized. And I think that's a really good attention grabber, too, which makes those places really important in that remembering process that you talk about in the book.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful park with a wonderful staff, and it is my home away from home now. And people have asked me, well, where are you going to spend July 4th, 2026? And it's a no-brainer for me. I'm going to be in Quincy.
Yeah.
Because not only was it the 250th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, but it's also the 200th anniversary of John Adams' death.
Yeah.
And there's no place that I want to be other than Quincy. Hopefully in the Church of the Presidents. I don't know what they have planned yet, but I've told my friends in Quincy I'm coming. So
Yeah.
we already have our hotel reservations. It's where I want to be.
Fantastic. Well, Marianne, I have really enjoyed chatting with you today. You're every bit as delightful in person as your book was to read. So
Oh,
thank you very
thank you
much.
so much. It's
Yeah.
the same to you.
Again, the book is Remembering John Adams, the Second President in History, Memory, and Popular Culture. It is available from McFarland Publishing, and I highly recommend it as a great look at John Adams and how we remember him. So
Thank you so much.
thank you, Marianne. I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.